Good morning, everyone. My name is Chris. I'm one of the second-year residents, and today I'm going to be talking about justice as fairness and healthcare. Just want to thank Dr. Kendall and the Social EM leadership for organizing this series of lectures. So most of us here share similar moral intuitions when it comes to healthcare, so I thought it'd be fun to explore some of the rationale behind some of our intuitions. I think it's important to find a theory of justice that you find convincing, because it should guide how we treat others and how we think society should function. So there are many different types of justice, including economic justice, environmental justice, and criminal justice, and so on and so forth. But in this lecture, I'm going to be talking exclusively about distributive justice, which is a type of justice that focuses on constructing principles that affect the distribution and benefits and burdens in societies. And within distributive justice, there are many different schools of thoughts, but in particular, I'm going to be talking about John Rawls' principles of justice. John Rawls was a 20th century American philosopher who saw vast inequalities within American society, and he wanted to generate principles of justice that would address some of these inequalities. And I decided to focus mainly on John Rawls' theory because his theory has been one of the most widely discussed and influential ones of the 20th century. So for today's outline, I'm going to first introduce John Rawls' principles of justice. In this first section, I'm going to mainly be talking about theoretical principles, which may seem esoteric and purely academic. But any discussion about resource allocation or healthcare distribution will implicitly touch upon theories of justice. In the next section, I'm going to talk about how Rawls' theory can be expanded to include healthcare. And lastly, I'm going to introduce some criticisms towards Rawls' theory. So I want to start off with a thought experiment, which is a tool philosophers use to test their intuitions and to generate general principles that can then be applied to more tangible scenarios. So if everyone can take a moment to imagine a hypothetical scenario in which you're sitting among an assembly of congressmen and congresswomen, and you're tasked with the responsibility of creating the rules for a brand new society. However, you, along with everyone else, are behind what Rawls would call a veil of ignorance. And behind this veil of ignorance, you're stripped of your identity. So you're unaware of certain aspects of yourself, such as your socioeconomic status, your sex, gender, race, ethnicity, and your natural abilities and talents, including your own conception of good. And in this original position, Rawls then asks us to imagine what rules of justice we would come up with so that once the veil is lifted, resources would be distributed fairly. Rawls proposed this thought experiment because he wanted to place individuals in a starting position that he thought was impartial and equal. He wanted to prevent individuals from tailoring principles of justice towards ways that would benefit themselves. So he felt that if principles could be derived from a starting position that was equal and fair, then those principles themselves would be also fair. So he largely saw justice as fairness. So in this hypothetical scenario, Rawls believed that individuals behind the veil of ignorance would agree upon certain things that every individual would want and require to pursue a life that fit their own conception of good. He called these things primary goods, and he used them as the fundamental metric of justice. And there are two types of primary goods. First is the natural primary goods, and the other one is the social primary goods. So natural primary goods are mainly things that are dictated by our genetics, such as our intelligence, our health, our vitality, our imagination, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, social primary goods have a social contingency, and they require the establishment of a functioning society. And within those things, Rawls includes liberties and rights. And these are basic liberties and rights such as liberty of conscience, freedom of association, freedom of speech, the right to vote and to hold office. He wouldn't include like arbitrary rights such as the right to not having to wear a mask when you're not vaccinated. He also includes opportunities, income and wealth, and self-respect within his social primary goods. And whenever there are multiple values at play, we have to account for possible conflicting values. So Rawls places a lexical ranking to his social primary goods. So liberties and rights take the utmost importance, followed by opportunities, income and wealth, and then self-respect. And the name of the game is to maximize each of the social primary goods without compromising the one that comes above it. So the question then arises, how should societal institutions distribute these social primary goods so that they're distributed fairly and justly? I think a good way to understand how Rawls arrives at his principles of justice is by examining his criticisms towards other types of distributive justice. So first, I'm going to be talking about the utilitarian system, which seeks to maximize the benefit of the majority. Rawls was a strong critic of utilitarianism because he felt that it didn't seriously take into account the differences and individuality of each person. And it could lead to scenarios in which people give up their rights and liberties for the greater good of society. So you can imagine a scenario in which utilitarianism would allow and justify the harvesting of organs from normal individuals for the greater good of society. Although the wellness of the greater society is maximized, it's at the expense of the minority, and Rawls saw this as very problematic. And we're all familiar with the idea of a strict egalitarian system. You can imagine a large pie and everyone's given an equal share of that pie. Although this seems like an appealing solution, Rawls saw problems with this issue. He felt that in a strict egalitarian system, incentives would be destroyed. So if everyone received the same type and amount of resources, people wouldn't be motivated to put in extra work and effort. Additionally, he recognized that different individuals have different requirements. As you can see in this picture, the little boy all the way on the right, although he has the same number of crates or social primary goods, he's not able to see the football game. Soccer game, sorry. An improvement upon the strict egalitarian system would be the libertarian system, which, although it incentivizes work, Rawls also saw problems with the system. So libertarian system pretty much distributes resources based on the functionings of a free and open market. However, Rawls felt that libertarian system didn't sufficiently account for the social lottery of birth. So we don't get to decide the family we're born into, or the wealth that we inherit, or the type of environment that we grew up in. And Rawls didn't want to base someone's social status on moral arbitrary factors that we had little control over. So if we were to level out the playing fields, that would bring us to a meritocratic system, which seeks to reward individuals based on their effort. In a meritocratic system, as shown in the picture, although people start from the same starting line, Rawls felt that meritocratic systems didn't sufficiently account for the genetic lottery of birth. So we don't get to dictate our health, our intelligence, or our vitality, and so on and so forth at birth. So he felt that a meritocratic system was limited. So in summary, so far Rawls would want a system that protects our basic rights and liberties, that incentivizes work and effort, and also accounts for the social and genetic lotteries of birth. And that brings us to Rawls' principles of justice. So Rawls thinks that individuals behind the veil of ignorance in the original position would agree upon two fundamental principles of justice to guide how societies should distribute resources fairly. So his first principle is the greatest equal liberty principle. And he states that each person has an equal claim to fully adequate scheme of equal basic rights and liberties. He largely envisioned his theory within a liberal democratic system because he felt that it was necessary for individuals to have certain basic rights and liberties in order for them to utilize the social primary goods in a way that fit their conception of good. And his second principle has two parts to it. This 2A is the equal opportunity principle. And similar to the meritocratic system we mentioned before, Rawls felt that equal opportunity did not extend far enough to account for the genetic lotteries of birth. So he also threw in principle 2B, which states that social and economic inequalities are fair if and only if they are to be to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society. So Rawls believed that individuals behind the veil of ignorance would agree upon the difference principle, which is what he called principle 2B, because he felt that these individuals would take a risk-averse stance, since they themselves could end up being one of the least well-off individuals once the veil is lifted. After acquiring a certain amount of social primary goods and after acquiring a certain amount of security, there comes a point of diminishing return. So Rawls believed that it's in the individual's best interest as well to raise the social status of the least advantaged members of society, in case they end up being one of those individuals once the veil is lifted. In addition, Rawls recognized that the fruits of our labor are largely dependent on a functioning society. So although he encourages individuals to benefit from their talents, their natural talents, he felt that a portion of that reward should be distributed back to society. So in this next section, I'm going to be talking about distributive justice, specifically Rawls in the setting of healthcare. In the first section, I wanted to introduce Rawls' theoretical principles because I think it lays some foundation for further discussion about healthcare distribution. So in Rawls' book, A Theory of Justice, he briefly mentions health as a natural primary good, but he's largely silent about the issue of healthcare distribution. And there are a few thoughts as to why that may be. One thought is because Rawls viewed health mainly as a natural primary good, he believed that natural primary goods weren't really under the direct control of social institutions. So he was primarily concerned with how institutions could distribute social primary goods. Additionally, the capabilities of healthcare are tightly linked to advancements in technology, which are far greater today than they were during Rawls' time. So the advancements in healthcare that we see today have widened health disparities and have revealed them to a greater extent. But although Rawls was largely silent about healthcare in his book, numerous prominent philosophers have attempted to show how healthcare can be incorporated into a Rawlsian system of distribution. So there are at least two main methods that these philosophers use to incorporate healthcare. First is by extending Rawls' list of social primary goods to incorporate healthcare. And the second is by showing that Rawls' principles of justice necessitate universal access to healthcare. So the first method, we're going to look at how we can extend Rawls' list of social primary goods to include healthcare. First, Rawls intended for his list of social primary goods to be flexible. He introduces the idea of reflective equilibrium, where he allows modifications to be made to his principles of justice to increase its overall cohesiveness. So he didn't mean for his list to be exhaustive. So before we can add healthcare to Rawls' list, we have to first answer two main questions. The first is, does fair healthcare distribution fit with Rawls' overall objective? And Rawls' main objective in having institutions distribute resources fairly was to address the moral arbitrariness that surrounds the genetic and social lotteries of birth. And because we now understand health to be both a natural endowment and a contingency of social circumstances, providing health and adequate health care would be in compliance with Rawls' overall objective. Rawls then goes on to describe the least well-off members of society as those who have the lowest index of primary goods when their prospects are viewed over a complete life. A complete life can be understood to include the prevention of premature death and the prevention of avoidable morbidity. So, and those two things are tightly linked to health and healthcare. So by providing adequate health and healthcare, we would be raising the social status of the least well-off members of society, which is in line with Rawls' goal. Then the second question we have to address is whether healthcare fits Rawls' definition of a social primary good. As we mentioned before, Rawls defines primary goods as things that every free, rational, and equal individual would require and desire in order to pursue a life that fit their conception of good. Although the individuals behind the veil of ignorance were said to have the mental and physical capacities to allow them to undergo Rawls' task and to be able to reason through Rawls' thought experiment, it's unlikely that they wouldn't recognize the dynamic status and nature of their health. So although they might be healthy individuals once the veil is lifted, they could very well lose that status through disease and accidents and just unfortunate circumstances that are out of their control. So it's very possible that the individuals behind the veil of ignorance would consider their own health when constructing the principles of justice. As for whether healthcare is a social primary good, healthcare is a product of social institutions and social structures. So because of that, healthcare would also fit Rawls' definition of a social primary good. The second method in which we can show how healthcare is compatible with Rawls' principles of justice is by demonstrating how Rawls' principles necessitate universal access to healthcare. So there are a lot of words here, but if you can suppose that health consists of a certain level of normal functioning, and this certain level of normal functioning helps protect our range of opportunities, then it should follow that society has an obligation to promote and protect normal functioning for all, so that all individuals have an equal access to opportunity. So in other words, by providing adequate access to health and healthcare, it helps broadens one's access to opportunity. In this last section, I'm going to be talking about main criticisms towards Rawls' theory of justice. The first is Amartya Sen, who is an Indian economist and philosopher. And he felt that Rawls focused too much on the amount of holdings an individual has. He felt that just focusing on holdings as a metric of justice came short because he thinks we should also consider one's ability to make use of those resources. So if you can think of an example where it might not be sufficient to give the same treatment, the same counseling, and the same discharge instructions to two individuals with the same diagnosis, if one of them has poor health literacy and as a result, poor compliance. By providing health, by incorporating healthcare into Rawls' theory of justice, Sen it would help improve one's capabilities to make use of their primary goods. But Sen would probably say that this comes short in addressing the health disparities that we see today. He would probably be in favor of broadening the definition of health and healthcare to include things like the social determinants of health, which we're much more familiar with today than during Rawls' time. And by addressing a variety of other factors, societal factors that affect one's health, we also address the individual's ability to effectively utilize resources and primary goods. And lastly, I want to introduce Robert Nozick. He was also an American philosopher, and he wrote a book in response to Rawls' theory of justice. Robert Nozick is one of the leading figures in libertarianism, and he felt that individuals had a natural born right to their holdings, as long as those holdings are just. So to him, entitlements to holdings are historic. So if you can prove that a holding came about through voluntary or permissible modes of action, then he would view those holdings as just, and he would think that the possessors are entitled to those holdings. So Nozick stresses the importance of self-ownership, self-agency, and self-autonomy, and he would probably disagree with Rawls that it is unjust to take entitled holdings from individuals without their permission to benefit the least well-off members of society. So in the end, whether or not you're convinced by Rawls' theory of justice, there are many different schools of thoughts. And I think it's helpful to find the theory of justice that you find appealing, since this kind of helps sets the stage for further discussions and arguments surrounding different theories of justice. So in summary, today we talked about Rawls' principles of justice, which came about through his veil of ignorance thought experiment. His two principles are the greatest equal liberty principle, and the second one has two parts: the equal opportunity principle and the difference principle. Then we talked about how healthcare can be incorporated into a Rawlsian system by one, either extending social primary goods to include healthcare, or by demonstrating that Rawls' principles of justice necessitate universal access to healthcare. And lastly, we looked at some main criticisms towards Rawls' theory of justice, including sense capabilities approach and Nozick's self-ownership arguments. So I have here my references. Thank you.